Okay, let's unpack this. The Bermuda Triangle. Just the name, and it conjures up these images. Vanished ships, planes disappearing, all that stuff.
Right, these mysteries that have sort of baffled people for decades.
Yeah, we're talking about this loosely defined patch of the North Atlantic, right? Roughly Florida, Bermuda, Puerto Rico.
Also called the Devil's Triangle, famous.
Mm-hmm. And for ages, it's been this legendary zone where things just, well, disappear.
Apparently. So today we're doing a deep dive. We've got a bunch of sources lined up.
Yep, Wikipedia, the Bermuda tourism site, even a YouTube documentary transcript.
And the mission is really to figure out what's actually going on.
Yeah.
Separate the fact from the fiction for you.
Exactly, because if you're listening, you're probably drawn to these kinds of enduring mysteries, right? You want to get to the bottom of it.
Absolutely. So let's start right at the beginning. The seeds of this whole legend were really sown mid-20th century.
That's right. Back in 1950, there was this article, Edward Van Winkle Jones for the Miami Herald, sort of hinting at unusual disappearances.
But it was George X. Sand, wasn't it? In '52 for Fate magazine.
Yeah, Sea Mystery at Our Back Door. That's the one that first really, drew the triangle shape on the map.
And he started listing those early cases. The Sandra, Flight 19, the Star Tiger.
That fishing skiff with Albert Snyder, a DC-3, the Star Ariel, too.
Right. So these early reports started painting this picture, place where maybe the normal rules didn't apply.
And it's interesting how these scattered mentions started to sort of come together into this recognized idea.
Yeah, and then in '62, Alan W. Eckert wrote about Flight 19 again, this time for the American Legion magazine.
Oh, and he included that quote, didn't he? The really evocative one from the flight leader.
Everything is wrong.
Mm.
Strange, the ocean doesn't look as it should.
Yeah, that definitely added fuel to the fire, made it sound like something really weird was happening there.
Totally. And then Vincent Gaddis, '64, Argosy magazine, the deadly Bermuda Triangle.
The name itself.
Exactly. And he took it further, linking Flight 19 to this whole pattern of strangeness going way back to like 1840. He even wrote a book, Invisible Horizons.
Right. And then others jumped on board. John Wallace Spencer, Charles Berlitz, Richard Weiner.
And some of them started bringing in the more, let's say, unconventional ideas, supernatural stuff.
Yeah, and it's funny, even the exact boundaries of the triangle, they kind of shifted depending on who you read.
Which is a really key point, actually.
Yeah.
If the area itself is so vaguely defined, how can you even say definitively what happens within it?
Good point. So before we get bogged down in, Atlantis and UFOs, maybe we should look at the criticism first. Get that perspective out there for you early on.
Definitely. Let's tackle the skeptical view. In 1975, Larry Kusha published his book, The Bermuda Triangle Mystery, Solved.
Solved. That's quite a claim.
It is, but his research was, well, pretty thorough. He basically argued that a lot of the claims from Gaddis and Berlitz and the others, they were exaggerated or dubious or just couldn't be verified.
So Kusha was saying the stories themselves were maybe the mystery, not the actual events, like how they got reported.
Exactly.
Yeah.
That's the fascinating part of his approach. He went back. He looked at the original sources, official reports, eyewitness accounts, newspaper archives.
And compared them to the sensational books.
Right. And he found some pretty big differences. Details left out, things added in, sometimes entire incidents just misrepresented.
Like what? Give us an example.
Well, Berlitz talked about the yachtsman Donald Crowhurst vanishing in the triangle.
Yeah.
But the actual evidence showed a very different, quite tragic story of deception and suicide. Nothing mysterious about the location itself.
Wow. Okay, so not just minor errors.
No, not at all. Kusha found cases where Berlitz claimed an ore carrier vanished in the Atlantic. It actually sank in the Pacific.
Seriously? Pacific?
Yeah, and a lot of the incidents tied to the triangle actually happened way outside any reasonable boundary you could draw.
And what about the weather? You mentioned that.
Crucial point. Kusha found newspaper reports from the time of some disappearances describing terrible storms. Storms the mystery writers just completely ignored.
So, if you add back the bad weather, the inaccurate locations, the exaggerations, the mystery starts to look a bit shaky, doesn't it?
Precisely. Kusha's conclusion was that the number of lost ships and planes wasn't actually statistically higher in the triangle than any other busy stretch of ocean.
Which makes sense, given it's prone to hurricanes and stuff.
Exactly. Tropical cyclones happen there. Disappearances are tragic, but sadly expected sometimes. And when you factor in the actual weather, many events weren't that mysterious.
And he said the numbers were inflated, too. Like reporting a ship missing, but not when it turned up later.
Yeah, shoddy research, basically.
Yeah.
A vessel goes missing, makes headlines, it gets found or towed back later. Crickets from the mystery authors.
Okay, this is where it gets really interesting for me. Kusha found cases where the mystery disappearances weren't even disappearances.
Right. Remember that plane Berlitz said vanished without trace in 1937?
Vaguely.
Turns out it crashed off Daytona Beach.
Yeah.
Hundreds of people saw it happen.
No way.
Yeah. So Kusha's final verdict was pretty blunt. He called the Bermuda Triangle mystery a manufactured mystery, kept alive by, bad research, faulty logic, and sensationalism.
Okay. And were other organizations saying similar things? What about, like, the insurance companies?
Good question. Lloyd's of London, the big marine insurance market, they stated clearly they didn't see an unusual number of sinkings there.
So they weren't charging higher premiums for ships going through the area?
Nope. Which you'd absolutely expect if it was genuinely extra dangerous, wouldn't you?
Yeah, absolutely. And the U.S. Coast Guard.
Also very skeptical. Their official records often contradict the claims in the Triangle books.
Like that tanker, the VA Fog. Some author claimed the crew vanished, except the captain holding a coffee cup.
Right, but the Coast Guard actually photographed the wreck, recovered bodies, and the whole thing happened off Texas, nowhere near the Triangle.
Texas. Okay.
Really.
That's quite a difference.
It really undermines the narrative, doesn't it? And there was that No VA documentary back in '76, The Case of the Bermuda Triangle.
What did they say?
Pretty much the same thing. They said the mystery just evaporates when you check the original sources. Their conclusion, ships and planes act the same way in the Triangle as anywhere else.
So why did the sensational story stick so much, do you think?
Well, researchers like Ernest Taves and Barry Singer pointed out that, mysteries sell. The paranormal is popular, it's profitable.
Ah, so there's a market demand for these dramatic stories, even if they're not strictly accurate?
That seems to be part of it. It creates a sort of feedback loop. And look at more recent stuff. In 2013, the Worldwide Fund for Nature listed the 10 most dangerous waters for shipping.
Let me guess, the Triangle wasn't on it.
Not even close, which puts it in perspective, right?
And Benjamin Radford, the investigator, he makes a good point about how hard it is just to find planes lost at sea anywhere.
Exactly. Just because wreckage isn't found immediately doesn't mean it's supernatural. He really stresses basic fact-checking, which seemed to be missing in a lot of the early Triangle stuff.
So NOAA, the weather people, what's their official line?
Pretty straightforward. Most disappearances. Down to environmental factors. Hurricanes, the Gulf Stream messing with weather, treacherous, shallow areas in places.
Right, and the U.S. Navy.
Same deal. Dismisses supernatural claims, points to natural causes, human error.
And the final nail in the coffin, maybe? The U.S. Board on Geographic Names?
Doesn't even recognize Bermuda Triangle as an official name or place.
Wow, okay. So after all that debunking, you'd think the mystery would just go away.
You would think, but, the human mind loves an enigma,
Mm-hmm.
and people have proposed explanations, even if they're not mainstream science.
Okay, let's touch on those. What about the paranormal ideas, the really out there ones?
Well, you've got the whole Atlantis theory. Lost technology from a sunken city somehow causing problems.
And that's sometimes linked to the Bimini Road, right? That underwater rock formation.
Exactly. Edgar Cayce, the psychic, predicted evidence of Atlantis would be found there. And when divers found those stones in '68, some people said, see, it's a road or a wall.
But geologists say it's natural.
Yeah, extensive geological analysis shows it's a natural limestone formation called beach rock. Just happens to look a bit like paving stones. But it shows how we want to find extraordinary explanations, doesn't it?
It does. What else? Parallel universes.
That's another one. The idea that the triangle is some kind of warp zone, a gateway sucking things into another dimension or time.
And UFOs, of course.
Always UFOs.
Yeah.
Charles Berlitz, who wrote a lot about this stuff, definitely leaned into anomalous forces, possibly extraterrestrial, being involved.
Okay. So moving away from Atlantis and aliens,
Yep.
what about the more plausible natural explanations?
Compass variations often come up. Stories of compasses spinning wildly.
Right, leading to theories of weird magnetic anomalies unique to the triangle.
Exactly. But scientists haven't actually found any unusual local magnetic fields there. What is real is magnetic declination.
Explain that simply for us.
Okay. So the North Magnetic Pole, where your compass needle points, isn't in the exact same place as the geographic North Pole, the top of the Earth's axis. The angle between those two directions changes depending on where you are on Earth. Over a large area like the triangle, that difference, the declination, can be significant. Navigators know this and compensate for it.
But if you weren't aware, or your chart was old, your compass could seem like it was leading you astray.
Precisely. It could seem really mysterious if you didn't understand the basic principle. It's not an anomaly, it's just normal compass behavior over distance.
Gotcha. What else? The Gulf Stream.
A hugely important factor. It's this massive, fast-moving current, like a river in the ocean flowing right through the area.
How fast are we talking?
It can move at like several knots, maybe up to 6 feet per second at the surface in places.
So if a plane goes down or a boat loses power.
The current can carry the debris or the vessel itself miles away from its last known position really quickly. Makes finding anything incredibly difficult.
Right, it just disperses everything. What about just human mistakes?
Sadly, yeah. Human error is cited in official inquiries for lost planes and ships all over the world, not just the Triangle.
Any specific examples often linked to the triangle?
Well, there's the case of Harvey Conover and his yacht, the Revenant, in 1958. He was an experienced sailor, but apparently sailed right into the teeth of a storm south of Florida. Maybe overconfidence, maybe misjudgment, but the outcome was tragic.
And just the general violent weather in that region?
Absolutely critical.
Yeah.
That part of the Atlantic gets hammered by hurricanes historically. Think about ships before weather satellites. They often had zero warning.
Yeah, you could sail right into one.
Exactly. And it's not just hurricanes. You can get really sudden, violent thunderstorms or even things like microbursts or downdrafts and columns of cold air smashing down onto the sea surface.
Like what happened to the Pride of Baltimore? Wasn't that suspected?
Yes, in 1986, a National Hurricane Center expert described those downdrafts hitting the water like a bomb. Imagine that hitting a sailing ship.
Terrifying. Okay, and then there's that other theory, the one from under the sea, methane hydrates.
The methane hydrate or gas hydrate theory. It's intriguing. The idea is you have these deposits of methane gas trapped in ice-like structures on the seabed on the continental shelf.
And they can erupt somehow.
Potentially. Sudden releases, sometimes called mud volcanoes, could release huge bubbles of methane gas. Lab experiments suggest this could create large areas of frothy water with much lower density.
Meaning a ship could just lose buoyancy and sink really fast.
That's the theory. Sink almost instantly without warning. And the USGS does confirm hydrates exist in the region, like off the U.S. southeast coast near the Blake Ridge.
But is there evidence this has happened recently?
That's the catch. The USGS also says their analysis suggests there haven't been any large-scale gas hydrate releases in the Bermuda Triangle area for something like 15,000 years.
Okay, so maybe not the explanation for Flight 19 or the Cyclops?
Probably not, based on the geological timeline. Compelling idea, but maybe not relevant to the modern mystery.
Right, so we've got the theories. Let's look at some of the specific incidents that really cemented the legend, the notable incidents. Let's try and give the quick version. What happened, when, and the likely non-mysterious cause. Starting way back, HMS Atalanta, 1880.
Okay, Atalanta.
Yeah.
British sail training ship. Vanished after leaving Bermuda for England. Crew was mostly inexperienced trainees.
And the likely cause.
Almost certainly sunk in a major storm that crossed its path a couple of weeks after it sailed. Research later pretty much debunked it as a specific triangle mystery. Similar fate to HMS Eurydice a couple of years earlier.
Okay. Then the big one, USS Cyclops, 1918. Largest non-combat loss of life in U.S. Navy history, you said.
Still is. Huge ship, a collier, carrying very heavy manganese ore. Disappeared after leaving Barbados. Over 300 people lost. No distress signal.
What are the main theories there?
Several factors likely contributed. It was overloaded with that dense ore, much heavier than the coal it was designed for. It had known structural weaknesses. One engine was out of action, and it might have encountered severe weather or possibly even a rogue wave.
And its sister ships also sank later, carrying heavy ore.
Yes, the Proteus and Nereus were lost in the Atlantic during WWII under similar circumstances. Suggests a design vulnerability when heavily loaded.
Okay. 1921, Carol A. Deering.
This was a big schooner found hard aground, sails set, but totally abandoned off Cape Hatteras, North Carolina. Food was apparently laid out in the galley.
So what happened to the crew?
Nobody knows for sure. The FBI looked into piracy, mutiny, rum runners. Couldn't prove anything. So it's an unsolved maritime mystery, certainly, but its connection to a specific Bermuda Triangle phenomenon is tenuous, especially given the location.
Right. And then Flight 19, 1945. Probably the most famous case.
Absolutely. 5 Navy Avenger torpedo bombers on a routine training flight out of Fort Lauderdale, they got lost.
And the official explanation?
The Navy investigation concluded navigational error. The flight leader, Lieutenant Charles Taylor, apparently became disoriented, possibly his compasses malfunctioned, and he led the flight further out to sea until they ran out of fuel.
And the search plane that also vanished? The PBM Mariner.
Yes, tragic irony. A Mariner flying boat went out to search and also disappeared. A tanker in the area reported seeing a large explosion and an oil slick around the time the Mariner would have been there.
And those planes had a reputation.
Mariners were sometimes nicknamed flying gas tanks. They were known to have issues with fuel vapor leaks building up. An explosion is sadly plausible, especially fully fueled for a long search.
And the documentary we saw really emphasized the difficulty of navigating back then.
Yes, the reenactment showed how reliant they were on compasses, visual landmarks, dead reckoning. If a compass was acting up and the weather got bad, getting lost, especially over open water that all looks the same, was a real danger. Taylor might have tragically mistaken his position.
Okay. Then the late 40s, Star Tiger and Star Ariel.
Two British South American Airways passenger planes, Avro Tudor V, both vanished without a trace on flights involving Bermuda, Star Tiger inbound from the Azores in 48, Star Ariel outbound to Jamaica in 49.
Any common factors?
A key thing was these planes were operating right at the limit of their range. There wasn't much margin for error. A slight navigational mistake, unexpected headwinds, engine trouble could have been critical. Bermuda's a small target in a big ocean.
Right. And the Douglas DC-3 in 1948.
Yeah, another vanished aircraft, flying from San Juan to Miami, 32 people on board, no trace ever found. The official investigation by the Civil Aeronautics Board basically said they didn't have enough information to determine a probable cause. Just insufficient data.
What about the Connemara IV in 1955? That sounds like a classic ghost ship story. Found adrift, crew gone.
It does get spun that way sometimes. The story often includes it surviving 3 hurricanes. But checking the records, Hurricane Ione passed nearby, and a letter cited by one author, Richard Weiner, actually explained the yacht dragged its moorings during Hurricane Janet while in harbor in Carlisle Bay.
So it wasn't mysteriously abandoned mid-ocean after weathering massive storms. It likely just broke free in a hurricane.
That seems the much more mundane and likely explanation.
Okay. Lastly, those KC-135 Stratotankers in 1963.
2 Air Force tankers collided mid-air during refueling west of Bermuda. Tragic accident.
But some triangle raiders claimed there were 2 crash sites miles apart, implying something strange split them up.
Yeah, that claim was made. But Larry Kush investigated that too. He found the unclassified Air Force report clearly identified the debris at the second supposed site. It wasn't aircraft wreckage. It was a large mass of seaweed and driftwood tangled around an old buoy.
So just flotsam, not a second crash.
Exactly. Another example of how checking the actual sources debunks the sensational claim.
Wow. Okay, so looking at these famous cases through that critical lens really changes the picture. And the documentary transcript brought in some other interesting perspectives too, didn't it? Like Bruce Gernon's flight.
Oh yeah, his 1970 experience is quite something. Flying his Bonanza encounters this bizarre cloud tunnel, talks about rotating lines, instruments going haywire, a sense of time distortion, even feeling like zero gravity or hydroplaning through the air.
It's a wild story.
It is. And it's become a cornerstone anecdote for many believers in the triangle's strangeness. But it's important to stress, it's his personal subjective experience. Unexplained, yes, but not necessarily supernatural proof.
Right. And the documentary also mentioned Charles Lindbergh noting compass issues back in 1928 over the Florida Strait.
Yeah, showing that experienced pilots have observed instrument oddities in the area, potentially linked to those natural magnetic variations we talked about.
And even Christopher Columbus reporting strange lights and compass behavior.
Centuries ago, likely natural phenomena, maybe St. Elmo's fire or meteorites, combined with the normal magnetic declination, but it adds to this long history of the area being seen as somehow unusual.
And Philippe Rougeat, the archaeologist in the doc, he had a very practical take on all the shipwrecks around Bermuda itself.
He did. He really hammered home how incredibly dangerous Bermuda's surrounding reef system is. These hidden breakers just below the surface. For centuries, they were a nightmare for navigation. He argues that's why there are so many wrecks nearby, not some mystery force, just treacherous geography.
Makes perfect sense. And Marvin Barish's deep dive into the USS Cyclops
Really highlights looking past the mysteriously disappeared label. Barish digs into the details.
Yeah.
The overloading with that super dense manganese ore, the ship's known stability problems, the broken engine, and then considers the rogue wave possibility.
And the documentary showed those wave tank experiments.
Yeah, from the Coastal Research Center in Hanover, showing how a massive rogue wave could, theoretically, capsize even a large ship like Cyclops almost instantaneously, a plausible mechanism for a sudden, catastrophic loss.
And Sylvia Wrigley's flight sim reenactment of Flight 19.
That was fascinating. It really visualized the challenges. Trying to navigate with a potentially faulty compass, worsening weather, over water with no landmarks.
Yeah.
It made you understand how disorientation and fatal errors could happen without needing any paranormal explanation.
Now, the documentary also mentioned Jiang Quasar's research. He claims there are still many unexplained cases.
Yes, Quasar argues there are dozens of incidents, even in official records like the NTSB's, that remain truly mysterious. He cited things like Flight NH-3808 in 1980, where the pilot apparently reported seeing a strange object, maybe a UFO, shortly before disappearing,
And there's that amateur video footage, too, from 2009.
allegedly showing UFOs near a cruise ship in the Triangle. Of course, the interpretation and authenticity of footage like that is always highly debatable.
What about Nick Hutchings and his explanation for compass weirdness?
He offered a geological explanation. Bermuda sits on an ancient, extinct volcano. He suggests there are high concentrations of magnetic iron ore on the seabed around the islands.
And that could mess with compasses.
Potentially, yeah. He demonstrated how even a small amount of this rock could deflect a compass needle significantly, maybe up to 14 degrees in some spots close to the islands, a natural cause for some of the reported anomalies.
Interesting. And Gurnon's own theory was about electronic fog.
Yes, that's his term for the strange cloud phenomenon he experienced, which he believes causes disorientation and instrument malfunction. It's part of his personal account, less of a widely accepted scientific theory.
Okay, so bringing it all together, what does the Bermuda tourism website say? How do they handle this whole thing in their FAQs?
It's quite balanced, actually.
Hmm,
They acknowledge the name came from Gaddis's article. They mentioned the deepest point in the Atlantic is technically within the general area.
but do they say it's dangerous?
No, they specifically state it's not considered dangerous today. They credit modern tech GPS, radar, better weather forecasting. They echo the official view. Natural causes, human error explain most things. It's heavily traveled and safe.
But they acknowledge the stories.
Oh yeah, they call them captivating stories, but emphasize no supernatural forces are confirmed. They point squarely at the environmental factors. Reefs, shallows, the Gulf Stream's weather influence, storms, hurricanes.
The compass thing.
They repeat NOAA's point. Sometimes magnetic compasses do naturally point towards true north in parts of the area due to declination, which can confuse people.
And their final word.
Pretty much aligns with NOAA and Kusha. Mysterious disappearances don't happen there any more often than in any other busy part of the ocean.
Right. So after going through all these sources, this whole deep dive, what's the main takeaway for you? What really stands out?
For me, it really solidifies the idea that the Bermuda Triangle mystery is largely a product of, well, a mix of things. Real environmental dangers, understandable human error in challenging conditions, but layered heavily with poor research, sensationalism, and just our basic human love for a good, spooky story.
Yeah. The actual evidence for anything truly paranormal or unique to that specific triangle shape just seems lacking, doesn't it?
It really does, especially when you compare the number of incidents to the absolutely massive amount of traffic ships, planes, yachts that goes through there every single day without a problem.
And you have major institutions, scientific bodies, the insurance industry, all saying, nope, nothing unusually dangerous here.
Exactly, that carries a lot of weight.
And yet, the myth persists, doesn't it? That documentary highlighted how much it still captures our imagination.
It absolutely does. It taps into that fascination with the unknown, the things science maybe hasn't fully explained yet, or the cases where maybe the evidence was lost to the sea forever.
So here's something for you, the listener, to think about. Why has the Bermuda Triangle myth been so persistent? Why does it hold on so tightly in popular culture, even with all this evidence pointing to more mundane explanations?
Yeah, what does that tell us about ourselves? About our need for mystery, maybe? Our desire for something bigger, stranger than just storms and navigation errors, even in our modern scientific world?
Maybe dig back into some of these sources yourself, or look into other maritime mysteries, or even the psychology of urban legends. It's all part of figuring out these stories we tell ourselves, isn't it?